Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley and you are listening to Biocast. What's our goal here? Understanding history one person at a time. If you're watching this right now, it means that you are viewing what was previously a Patreon exclusive video. So I've decided to make all of these videos free. I want to keep as little content behind a paywall as possible because I think this is some really good information and I think people can really learn from it. And by putting it behind that paywall, I know that it means that there are just some people that are not going to be able to view this stuff. So I decided against it. If you want to check out my Patreon, you can get an exclusive weekly live stream where I talk about basically anything you want. You can check that out at patreon.com/biocast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this video. And today we're going to be talking about one of the primary books that I used to create the Cleopatra Biocast episode. So I'm going to assume that you've already listened to that. I think it would be a good idea to do so. I mean, if you're listening to this first, that's a little weird, but I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life, man. You do what you want to do, man. But I do think that this book was really interesting for a bunch of different reasons. Now, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad, and I'm not holding any punches here. Like, I'm going to tell you guys exactly what I think. And if you were really interested in the life of Cleopatra from the Biocast episode and you want to learn more and you're not sure you want to buy this book, you came to the right place because, you're going to find out here if this is going to be a good purchase for you. So let's jump right on into it. So we're going to start off with the good. So it is very well researched, very well fact checked. And I think that's something that's really important. It kind of goes without saying. And I think the reason that I even mention this is because she gets very particular with the details. When someone goes in depth and gets in, they delve into the specifics of the topic, that's where your real knowledge, your real information comes from. Because, like, think of an example here from the book. Imagine someone told you, oh, Cleopatra was really wealthy. Well, what does that mean? Was she like, upper middle class wealthy, or was she like one of the richest people in the world to have ever lived wealthy? Well, it's like, you don't really know. It's a vague sentence. Well, she actually dives into the specifics and tells you exactly how much money she made. Well, not exactly, as accurately as she could with the historical sources, how much Cleopatra would have made. And it was between 12 and 15 talents, which, that's like a good chunk of the entire economy of, the country, which is just an insane amount. Like, the entire GDP of, the entire nation of Egypt was less than what Cleopatra was making herself. So, suffice to say, she was very, very wealthy. And I think, information like that, it sheds a lot of light on some of this stuff. I think, the more nuanced, the more detail you can give in your book, the better. And that's my take on it. Okay, so big point number 2. She frequently talks about the sources, their worldviews, their perspectives. When you can get an understanding of the people who write the history that you're reading, man, that gives you like a whole new layer of perception on the entire topic. So I vividly remember her talking about Cicero. And Cicero actually personally knew Cleopatra. He met her a couple of times. He personally knew Julius Caesar. And, these are all a bunch of big names. And when you can actually get down to it, why did Cicero write what he wrote? Why did he have, he did have a very negative perception of Cleopatra. And, if I remember correctly, it had everything to do with this fact that, she was a decadent, wealthy Easterner. She was someone that was kind of the epitome of what happens with, a degenerate civilization. Cicero was very much one of the, let's be strong, let's build up our civilization, and not get too fancy or decadent along the way. And that influenced the way that he perceived her. And, he wrote a lot of pretty negative stuff about her, and a lot of the negative stuff that has continued, down the line of history about Cleopatra, a lot of it stems from him. And then even she goes into detail on Plutarch as well, this was a guy who was writing, I think, 100 years after Cleopatra had actually lived. So stuff like that definitely sheds a lot of light. I think it's very important to understand, that about Cicero and about Plutarch, because it gives you a good idea of what to expect from their writing. How much credibility do they have on this topic? And with any ancient source, you always have to have, you have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to have a little bit of skepticism. Why are they writing what they're writing? Why did this person want me to think this? Another really good point was that Cicero was someone that he knew that thousands of years later people would be reading his writings. He was a very wise man, very ahead of his time. He understood that people, the only way to keep your message going throughout time is to write stuff down. So, very wise guy. And I think a lot of the discussion around, these different sources and their own worldviews and perceptions about Cleopatra, I thought that was some really interesting discussion. In fact, some of the best content in the book, personally, for me. But that's me. That's my own weird little niche interest because, perspectives. Now, let's get into some of the criticisms that I have of this book, which there are a couple. So, number one is that there are some very long paragraphs that really could have been condensed. Sometimes I felt like, I'll be honest with you, there were times I just skipped an entire page or two because I was just like, oh God, this just goes on and on and on and about something that I really did not care about. Now, that could be a personal thing, like maybe this just happened to be something I didn't care about, but someone else may have. But it's an opinion thing. I definitely had quite a few times throughout reading this book that I felt like I was just really bored and I had to skip a page or two ahead. Definitely happens. And if you get this book, if your brain is like mine, it might happen to you a few times too. And yeah, there's a lot of unnecessary language and rhetoric. I definitely think that there's a lot of this author trying to dress the language up in a fancy way. And understandably so. You want your book to be interesting and captivating. But, fancy language doesn't always do that. I think that, it would have done Cleopatra's story a lot more justice to have been a little bit more bare bones in that sense. You can give a lot of detail. You can be very informative without having all these fancy nuances and different unique ways of saying things. There were definitely some words throughout here I was like, I've never read that word before. To someone, people our age, assuming you're like a 20-something, right? I don't know if you're a 50-year-old, who knows, man? Whatever, Grandpa. Whatever floats your boat, man. You're more than welcome here. But, I'm assuming if you're my age, you probably definitely have that same feeling of like, oh, wow, this feels like someone went on thesaurus, to try to sound smart. So there is some of that going on. Now, this was one of the big problems that I had with this, as well as many of the other reviews that I was reading online. There's not a very strong sense of continuity throughout this book. It very much feels like, she'll kind of go along, and then she'll briefly mention, oh yeah, this other Roman general, and then she'll dive into 5 pages of just talking about this other side story that's how is this relevant to Cleopatra? There were definitely points throughout this book that I had that thought. I was like, I'm reading a book about Cleopatra. I'm on the 7th page now talking about these obscure details about the Roman Civil War. And I understand that the Roman Civil War, played a big role in Cleopatra, but it's like, I just remember there being a lot of details about the Civil War that I didn't really feel like were that necessary for Cleopatra's story. Maybe that's just me. I'm sure she had her reasons when writing this book for whatever the reason may have been. But, I definitely felt like there were some points where I felt like it just, like, the story stopped being a story, and it was just like, here is everything you can ever know about, the Civil War. And I was like, and again, I said it earlier, and I'll say it again. There were some points in this book where I was just kind of like, I skipped a few pages. Sometimes you got to do that to get to the good stuff in a book. And, for me, I definitely had to do that. But again, you might not have a brain like mine. It's definitely a personal opinion. And here was the one thing that I really couldn't help but notice. This is a very opinionated book. Very opinionated. And it has an agenda. And it's a modern feminist. I don't know how you would want to say that. And I'm not trying to disparage feminism or the author or anything, anyone else. But when reading this book, I definitely had a feeling of, this is someone who wants to look back and see this entire person's life through the lens of 21st century feminism. And I'm going to try to frame it and make it sound as if, this was an oppressed woman who was just smarter and more elegant and way more competent than all these dumbass men around her. These guys, Julius Caesar, he was an idiot. He was nothing without Cleopatra. Mark Antony, too. They were just all incompetent fools. I mean, it's a little off-putting because this book reeks of that. It really does. And, it is what it is. I understand the way the book was marketed. I kind of get that's the kind of audience and the kind of people that they're going after, the kind of, you know what I mean? And, I get it. All I'm trying to say is I get it, but if you're thinking of buying this book, definitely know this is going to be part of the book. This is going to be like, it's a very strong undertone throughout every sentence, the way things are framed. They just make it out like Cleopatra was this magnificent, omnipotent person who was, just insanely competent and smart and, every other good word you can think of. And, everyone else is just kind of an idiot. And it's just kind of off-putting, especially because, there were points where it definitely felt like she was writing negatively about someone like Cicero. And it drives me insane because Cicero is like one of the smartest people to have ever lived. Cicero earned what, his position in life. He wasn't just born into some monarchy. He was like I think one of the smartest people to have ever lived. He's not up there with Plato or Aristotle, but he actually put his ideas into practice. He had the balance of philosophy and practical action. He actually applied his philosophy, and I have a lot of respect. I consider Cicero one of those people who I really admire, and seeing the author kind of bash him, kind of make him out like, oh, he just hated Cleopatra for no reason. So be aware, if you're a Cicero fan, don't buy this book. And another thing I noticed was there's definitely an anti-Roman bias. Definitely. And there was one point when she was talking about Cleopatra's visits to Rome. And it very much sounded like Cleopatra was coming from a first world country and visiting Rome, which was a third world country. That's how she described it, which is, you know what? I'm not an ancient historian. I'm just going to tell you that right now. But I don't think Rome at peak Roman Empire was third world. It may not have been as fancy as Cleopatra's castle, but Alexandria was, let's just be real. There was multiple wars going on there. There was a lot of chaos. There was this perpetual ethnic conflicts between the Greeks and Macedonians and the native Egyptians. Trying to paint it like, Egypt and the Alexandrians were just these high, sophisticated, upper-class intellectuals of great culture and art. It just seemed very weird. It just seemed like such a strange thing to have encountered. And I'm sure some of that is kind of connected to this idea of, it kind of goes along with this feminist narrative, the Alexandrians and, under Cleopatra's rule, of course, not her brother or father, they were ruining everything. But this empowered Cleopatra, she did everything wonderfully. The economy was great. Everything was wonderful, and that she really, goes around all the problems that Cleopatra had. She kind of says it oh yeah, these were the problems with the government. But, Cleopatra was in charge, so Cleopatra's in charge of the government when everything goes good. But when things go wrong, there's crazy corruption, that's not Cleopatra's fault. It's the Egyptian government, kind of how it was. And, yeah, there were definitely some points where I felt like things were over-explained and it was just a completely random tangent, and there are a couple of examples I could point to. I think I already talked about how there was the over-explanation on the Roman Civil War part. That was definitely strange, and I was almost waiting, when is she gonna stop talking about this Roman Civil War? It just seemed weird, and then there were other points where, she would mention Cleopatra's sister, and then it's oh, well, I guess we're hearing 3 pages about Cleopatra's sister now and some unrelated side story, again. And yeah, that's really it. So those are some of my thoughts. Overall though, I would still say this was a pretty good book. If you want more information on Cleopatra and a decent read, you can definitely check this book out. I will have a link to it in the description or connected to this post somewhere if you would like to purchase this book. Thank you so much for being a Biocast supporter. And remember, there's going to be a lot more content. So if you want to, if you want more information about Cleopatra, about the creative process I went through, really anything connected about Cleopatra, and even some random jabber and thoughts on the entire thing. All of that's going to be available here. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.